One reads, the protection of places of worship, synagogues, churches, and mosques is a duty guaranteed by religions, human values, laws, and international agreements. Every attempt to attack places of worship or threaten them by violent assaults, bombings, or destruction is a deviation from the teaching of religions as well as a clear violation of international law. Compared with the great lines designed in the document, the duty to protect places of worship appears to be marginal. Nevertheless, the issue has a wide-ranging impact on social coherence, politics, and even warfare. Social coherence is affected by the duty to protect places of worship when churches are attacked by Islamists in Nigeria, Iraq, or Pakistan, and when synagogues and mosques are assaulted in Europe. Politics is affected when the erection of synagogues, churches, or mosques is complicated or forbidden by administration or public law. Warfare is affected when belligerent power misuse places of worship as storage for weapons or launching bases for missiles. In what follows, I will first outline why places of worship are usually held in high esteem not only by believers, but also by unbelievers. The second chapter means the difficulty of sharing places of worship among followers of different religions. Frequently, the indivisibility of sacred sites makes sharing impossible. Instead, it incites tensions and even violent confrontations between followers of competing religions. Yet conflicts on places of worship show a twofold dimension. Either such places are directly targeted to offend believers of another religion, or damaging or even destroying places of worship is accepted due to military needs. Both cases are subject to international humanitarian law. Particularly in asymmetric warfare, protecting places of worship raises pressing moral challenges. This will chapter 4. And to ensure religious practice, religious authorities and public elites must cooperate to protect places of worship, what is done in the Abu Dhabi document. For the first chapter, religious dimension of places of worship. Most religions allow performing rituals and prayer nearly everywhere on the globe. For religious practitioners, however, geography is not uniform. Salvation can be obtained more easily where the sacred sphere breaks through into the human realm and becomes accessible. Sacred shrines intensify this phenomenon. Usually, practitioners of a particular religion consider the respective places as holy or sacred. Thus, they become religious centers and are invaded by rituals, prayer, and pilgrimage. Religions encompass different approaches to sacred sites. Sometimes, places of worship are restricted areas where only believers are permitted to enter. Non-believers must be kept outside. And when they enter a place of worship, they must behave according to the regulations of the community of believers who use the place for their rituals and prayers.
If I speak here, can I take out this one?
Valuing places of worship varies between and within religions. In Christianity, the nature of churches is differently valued by Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians. The so-called Holy Land has different meaning for members of the various Christian denominations. Not to speak about the special commitment of Jews to Eretz Israel. For Sunni Muslims, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem are significant places. Shiites venerate Karbala, where Hussein was assassinated. Notwithstanding prevailing differences, places of worship, temples, synagogues, churches, or mosques have a special significance in the eyes of religious believers. They memorize revelatory events or significant events in the history of the respective religion. Believers regard sacred sites as symbolizing their respective beliefs. Symbolizing means that by nature, indivisible divine sphere is somehow materialized at a specific place. Buildings and artifacts on such extraordinary sites provide the scenery for prayers and rituals which constitute foundational elements of a particular religion. Consequently, assaulting, damaging, or destroying the symbolic representation of religious belief hurts the center of the religion itself. It undermines the basis of religious traditions and menaces the identity of its followers. Viewed from the defeated party, the demolition or destruction of places of worship is not far from sacrilege or blasphemy, which usually are estimated as the worst crimes in religious affairs. This being said, it becomes clear why all religions convene in repelling threats to places of worship. Inside the closed space of the sanctuary, violent action is strictly forbidden. Walls and gates protect the sanctuary against attacks from outside. Demolition and destruction are sanctioned by divine power. In modern times, divine power is somehow replaced by international humanitarian law that aims at protecting places of worship against human assaults. The foundational impact of places of worship on the identity of a religious community makes evident why it is so difficult to share places of worship among followers of different religions. This observation leads to the second chapter of my paper. The indivisibility of places of worship. According to the American political scientist Ron A. Hassner, sacred places are indivisible. Because of their foundational significance for religious individuals and groups, such places cannot be shared with followers of other religions. Usually, they are passionately disputed and even contested. Hassner exemplifies his thesis referring to Jerusalem and Ayodhya. For different reasons and according to different traditions, Jerusalem is considered holy by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Ayodhya in northern India, in turn, is contested by Muslims and Hindus. Opposing claims for worship, ritual, and prayer frequently incite violent clashes between followers of the involved religions. Only exceptionally, performing rituals and prayers at shared places of worship turns out harmoniously. Usually, it is very difficult to avoid assaults and incursions between the followers of competing denominations or religions. How to explain such tendencies? One of the reasons is that religion usually claim to represent truthful interpretations of the whole of reality. Religions claim to present truthful interpretation of the whole of reality. Religions are reluctant to accept competing interpretations of reality. Thus, their followers tend to be exclusivists, or at least inclusivists insofar as they consider other religions just as a minor expression of the universal truth that is entirely present only in their own religion. Pluralistic views of religion, according to which the universal truth is expressed in different ways, but is authentically present in every religion, are minority positions among the believers. Exclusivists tend to reject competing religious claims not only by argument, but even by violence. Thus, assaults and incursions are most likely when the same place of worship is claimed by followers of different religions. Sacred sites tend to be more contentious than secular ones. Peaceful solutions are more difficult to achieve than in ordinary territorial disputes. That's why Hassner speaks of the indivisibility of sacred sites and places of worship. When, as a result of armed conflicts, followers of competing religions come to power, expropriation, destruction, or conversion of places of worship is the rule. History provides many examples for this. After the Crusaders' conquest of Jerusalem, the mosques on the Temple Mount were converted to Christian churches. After the Ottomans' conquest of Constantinople, many churches and monasteries were converted to mosques. More cases can easily be added, and they reach the present day. I only refer to the expulsion of Armenian Christians after the occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh by troops from Azerbaijan in September 23. Expropriation, conversion, and even destruction of places of worship after military victory and conquest is more than ransacking. It is a way of humiliating the defeated enemy. It erases religious traditions and cultural identities. More than destroying places of worship, converting them to the religion of the victorious power stresses the claim to superiority. In late antiquity, for example, the conversion of pagan temples into churches aimed at demonstrating the superiority of Christianity. Associated with the expansion of Islam, however, the Prophet and his successors prescribed respecting existing places of worship. Contrarily, however, during the so-called Reconquista, Christians converted mosques to churches to wipe out the extensive Muslim history and culture in Al-Andalus. Likewise, in the beginning of the 20th century, the expropriation and destruction of Greek and Armenian Christian churches by the Turks aimed at ending the multi-religious identity of the Ottoman Empire. When in Iraq and Syria the Islamic State came to power, plundering, demolition, and destruction of Christian churches and monasteries was intended to prove the superiority of Islam. And another famous example I already mentioned is the destruction of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. This event illustrates that the conversion of places of worship is not restricted to Muslim Christian history and controversies. Admittedly, there are few examples of followers of different religions who share places of worship. Usually, however, strict rules of prayer and ritual allow a kind of side-by-side presence. To prevent violent attacks and incursions, worshippers are separated by time and space. At the grave place of Abraham and his family in Hebron, we face an extraordinary multi-religious site. A Jewish synagogue and a Muslim mosque are located inside a pagan building built by King Herod the Great and equipped as a Christian church during the Crusaders period. To avoid violent confrontation, strict regulations restrain access to the building and must be respected by Jews and Muslims when using it for prayer and worship. Other sites in the Holy Land are partly shared and partly contested, include the Chapel of the Ascension on Mount Zion, where Christian and Muslims claim the right to pray, Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, claimed both by Jews and Muslims, and David's tombs on Mount Zion, equally claimed by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, competing Christian denominations share one building for different liturgies, celebrated at fixed places inside the church. A strict status quo of times and places of worshipping dating back to the 18th century must be respected by the 6 Christian denominations present in the church. Strange enough, the implementation of the status quo is controlled by a Muslim family, which points to the fact that here a third party who has the power is responsible for the observation, to observe the regulations. In a global view, peaceful sharing of places of worship of followers of different denominations of religions is exceptional. The question then arises how to deal with opposing claims on sacred sites to prevent violent clashes between believers who are committed to different denominations and religions. The question refers to the need for legal regulations to efficiently protect places of worship against assaults, demolition, or even destruction. And this brings us to international humanitarian law, which is explicitly referred to by Pope Francis and Attayeb in the Fraternity document. In international humanitarian law, places of worship enjoy special attention. This cannot be taken for granted, insofar as international law follows the idea of religious neutrality. Suppose that, according to international law, all individuals and groups must be treated equally, special protection of places of worship seems to be unjust. How can one then justify the special care for places of worship by international law? Evidently, non-believers do not share the religious claims raised by the believers, and indeed, holiness is no category in international law. When the law talks about the holy places, it does not assume that sites are sacred, but they are perceived as sacred by some groups of believers. As a rule, international law respects religious convictions and beliefs. Article 18 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights declares, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom, either individually or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. International humanitarian law values rituals, prayers, and other religious practices as expressions of the human right of freedom of religion. This not at least affects the protection of places of worship. The argument is that places of worship provide space for practicing one's religion, provided they do not hurt the other citizens' freedom to do so. Consequently, international law sees the protections of places of worship as a duty for all human beings. It acknowledges religions and their ritual practices as authentic expressions of human life on earth. That's why the destruction of historical monuments, churches, and other places of worship during the reign of the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was almost unanimously condemned by the international community. The motivation was not the truth claims of the offended religious communities, but the human right to freely practice their religious beliefs. Frequently, places of worship bear outstanding artifacts or cultural assets. That's why international humanitarian law sees the protections of places of worship as part of the protection of the cultural heritage of all nations. The 77 protocols on armed conflicts that were added to the 49 Geneva Conventions include provisions on the protection of cultural targets, including places of worship. Religious monuments and works of religious art do not belong to a religious community exclusively, but are elements of the common legacy of mankind. Being linked to ideas, living traditions, and beliefs, places of worship represent important stages of human history. Due to the right of practicing one's religion's freedom, it suffices that the artistic or historical value is acknowledged only by the attacked party. Damaging, spoiling, and destroying the site would deeply affect the historical identity of the respective group. Infringement of their places of worship violates the right of religious communities to practice their belief according to their traditions and self-understanding. Besides direct attacks on places of worship are frequently involved in armed conflicts incidentally. Particularly in asymmetric warfare, places of worship are often used by insurgents to hide weapons or even as bases to attack the enemy. This leads to the last step of our reflection. Because of the fundamental importance of places of worship to believers, such places are protected by international law. Article 27 of the Hague Convention states, in sieges and bombardments, all necessary steps must be taken to spare, as far as possible, buildings dedicated to religion, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not being used at the time for military purposes. Evidently, the restricted clause at the end of the regulation raises a profound ethical challenge to the belligerent powers. The problem can be illustrated by referring to the Israeli attacks on churches and mosques during the Gaza war. Undeniable, Hamas stored weapons in buildings like hospitals, schools, mosques, and even churches. Launching rockets from buildings listed in the international conventions undoubtedly violates international law. Thus, it seems clear that the opposing power is allowed to attack the respective buildings. Nevertheless, we face an ethical dilemma. On the one hand, mosques and churches are protected by international law. On the other hand, they are apparently misused by one of the belligerent parties. And the case becomes even more complicated when, first, we reckon with the possibility that non-combatant persons, civilians, are on the ground, or second, the respective place of worship is a significant site of mankind's cultural heritage. Places of worship such as synagogues, churches, and mosques often serve as shelters for non-combatant civilians and refugees. Under international law, such places must be spared in military action. International law also prohibits the use of civilians as human shields. Nevertheless, particularly in asymmetric warfare, such behavior is common. Taken as a whole, what does the international law of war imply for places of worship when belligerent misuse them for military purposes? Undoubtedly, such situations pose pressing moral challenges for military commanders in the field, especially when their soldiers are directly targeted from these places. How can non-combatants be spared when such places are attacked for self-protection? How to balance humanitarian and military demands, which both are well-founded? Traditionally, the usage of military means is justified under three conditions. First, such means must promise to efficiently carry out the intended success. Second, they must respect the proportionality between military means and the intended effect. Third, military means must not be used indiscriminately. Regarding places of worship, all these conditions must be carefully considered before attacking them for tactical reasons during an armed conflict. Due to the lack of time, unfortunately, I cannot discuss the issue extensively here. Instead, I will direct my final deliberation to the question, what might be the contribution of religions and their followers to overcome tensions at places of worship and protect them in armed conflicts? In conflicts, the escalation is mandatory to calm down even opposing powers. Can religions contribute to de-escalation? Perspectives are ambivalent, as the relation of religions to violence is in general. Stressing truth claims, religions can fuel conflicts. Referring to the transcendence of the divine, religions can contribute to de-escalating conflicts. A lot depends on the personal engagement of the responsible representatives of the involved religious communities. In January 21, religious leaders and representatives of faith traditions issued a universal code of conduct on holy sites. Thereby, they declared their commitment to seek peace and pursue it following their respective religious traditions. Their signatories proposed binding commitments concerning the preservation of holy sites, guarantee of access, efficient conflict prevention and resolution. Legal arrangements are recommended when sites are sacred to more than one religion. Aware of the outstanding challenges worldwide, the Universal Code underlines the need for efficient implementation and monitoring. Due to the multi-layered dimensions of conflicts over places of worship, religious leaders and the political elite must cooperate. Religious leaders on one side and the political elite must cooperate to reconfigure sacred places to achieve a peaceful sharing of contested territories. To this end, all parties must act to achieve an innovating reframing of the conflict and its ideological background. Stressing the responsibility of religious leaders and believers to protect places of worship, Pope Francis and the Grand Imam at-Tayyib not only advocate envisaging a good compromise in case of a conflict, referring to international law, both presuppose that the implementation of already existing international law must be enforced by efficient power. And what is more, they encouraged delegitimizing any use of violence in the name of God. And indeed, due to the ambivalence of military power, it needs clear statements from religious authorities that divergent religious commitments and worldviews must be tolerated by believers. One might argue that religious tolerance is rooted in God's transcendence due to God's ultimate incomprehensibility. Any exclusivism in matters of faith and religious practice is unfounded. And I will come to an end by a last quotation from the document. The quotation is, "We ask this on the basis of our common belief in God, who did not create men and women to be killed or to be fight one another, nor to be tortured or humiliated in their lives and circumstances." Now the last sentence, "God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone." In the past, neither Christianity nor Islam were sufficiently clear in this respect. And even today, many Christian and Muslim leaders have still to go a long way. The Fraternity document encourages us to walk together. Thank you for listening.